Joining us now is retired Rear Admiral Mike Hewitt, former Deputy Director for Global Operations at the Pentagon, all the way over there in Washington. Thanks for coming on board again, Mike. Good to talk to you. We're told, we're warned that there may be a strike by Iran on Israel involving perhaps direct missiles and indeed drone bombs within 2 days. Would you agree with that prediction?
Well, I think it's important to put it into the right context. There's been a proxy war between Iran and Israel going back to 1985. Israel has hit over 300 airstrikes into Syria on Iranian positions. This latest attack on the consulate obviously has amped up the rhetoric between Iran and Israel. The one thing I would say about Iran is they will be very measured in any type of response that they make. The last thing in the world Iran wants is a kinetic fight with Israel and the West. And the number one goal of Iran is the protection of their regime. So they don't win in a direct confrontation with Israel. What they win is in this political fight to undermine the will of the West to support Israel in its goal of destroying Hamas.
On some level, though, that's kind of now gone the opposite direction, because ever since the taking out of the Quds general and Iran threatening retaliation, it's almost sort of reminded Joe Biden that America's supposed to be an ally of Israel at a time when he was bleating on about stopping giving them weapons and immediate ceasefires.
That's a very good point. If you look back to every time we've taken on Iran in any kind of way, when the U.S. took out Soleimani, this recent attack by Israel on the Quds Force leader in Syria, the rhetoric that Iran will retaliate has always been there, but we've never actually seen that. We've actually seen them retract in their offensive position when we take them on. And I think the clearer point that you just made is the American administration under Joe Biden has actually undermined Israel's goal of defeating Hamas by shifting away from the destruction of Hamas to demanding immediate ceasefire. In actuality, that's what Iran is seeking, is undermining Israel and pushing the West out of the Middle East. And so I would argue the rhetoric behind the response is really the goal that they've tried to create.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about this. I think we spoke to you about this last time, Mike. Joe Biden and over here, our Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, and indeed our Foreign Secretary David Cameron, their rhetoric is getting essentially more and more anti-Israel. Several Jewish commentators here in Britain are now saying, thanks to this, Hamas has virtually won the war in Israel. Israel, up to about 3 or 4 weeks ago, had hundreds of thousands of IDF troops in Gaza, only 1,000 in there now. Do you fear that this continued narrative from Britain and America in particular, President Biden especially, saying ceasefire, stop the genocide and all this, it is undermining Israel in this conflict, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And if you have to understand how this got started, it was Russia and China that flooded and bombarded social media with pro-Hamas, pro-Palestine, anti-Semitic social media tropes to further undermine the goal of Israel. When Hamas did their devastating attack on the country of Israel, we were of one voice, which is to destroy Hamas in Gaza. This is not about the people of Gaza. This is about Hamas. And I think this new rhetoric around a ceasefire absolutely emboldens both Iran and Hamas. And if we get into a ceasefire, essentially Hamas has won this war.
One of the negotiating chips, of course, that Hamas are using in any of their talks is the hostages, and the big protests in Israel over the hostages, people saying that Netanyahu needs to do more to get them back. But I was reading the other day that there's sort of, a growing sense among people who work in the intelligence sector that, well, there may not be many of them left alive. What do you reckon?
It's really an area that we should be focusing on. I mean, there are American hostages in Gaza right now, but we never hear about their names. We never talk about who they are. And this is really playing into Hamas's hands. If you look at Hamas's care for human life, they hide in tunnels, over 300 miles of tunnels dug in underneath the civilians of Gaza. They want the civilians to be targets. And I do think that we need to go back to understanding you don't negotiate with terrorists, particularly when it comes to hostages. And what Israel has done since the beginning of this war, in many, many ways, has compromised their ability to defeat Hamas by protecting the civilians and ensuring that we don't have civilian casualties. They've been very methodical. They have been very careful. And we need to give Israel the tools and the time they need to defeat Hamas. And anything less than that, and Iran and the proxies win.
To go back to my original question to you, Mike, what is your prediction? I mean, as of yesterday, everyone seemed to be absolutely convinced that within a couple of days, this strike from Iran on Israel would happen. We're hearing now that the supreme leader is mulling the political potential of this situation and is therefore scaling back a little. But who knows what the truth is? What is your estimation? Is this a real threat within a couple of days or a week, or do you feel it may not happen?
If I had to bet right now, I don't think you're going to see a direct confrontation with Iran. The supreme leader will always decide based on the protection of the regime. And what he doesn't want to do is escalate this fight. So I don't think you're going to see any kind of direct kinetic attack on Israel. But as you need to remember, there are attacks almost every day on Israelis with missile attacks. What you won't see is a kind of confrontation in a conventional way that we think of. You'll see continued terrorist attacks, missile attacks, terrorism throughout the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, but you won't see the kind of direct confrontation that I think the media is portraying right now.
A lot of what's going on in the Middle East always revolves around propaganda and creating instability. And at the moment, I think this is one of the most propagandized wars I've ever seen. The focus is largely on humanitarian aid, and the West saying, this is dreadful. We've got to get at least 500 aid trucks into Gaza. People are going to starve. You've got various countries airdropping things in, trying to get aid in via sea routes. And I'm there thinking, well, how is that aid being distributed? Is Hamas using this as a weapon of war? Because I've seen bits and bobs of social media, and is it Israeli propaganda? I don't know, suggesting that actually Hamas might be deliberately frustrating those processes, reselling aid to get more money, potentially even preventing aid from getting to civilians to trigger a crisis. What is your take on all of this? I mean, are Israel doing enough when it comes to getting aid into the country, or is Hamas there involving themselves to make this into an even bigger crisis?
The aid that Israel is pushing into Gaza is quite robust. And if you follow, just in the last week, they've opened up additional transit lines for aid to get into the northern half of Gaza. You've got the U.S. talking about building a maritime port to attract additional aid into the country. And that very port will be threatened by the Houthis and by the Iranians. So here we are trying to support aid into Gaza, at the same time being threatened in the support to do that. And I think your point is very spot on. Hamas does not care about the civilians of Gaza. They want them to be starving. They want them to be front and center in this confrontation, because human casualty is their main weapon of war against the West. And they're playing against our moral clarity, which right now is not very clear at all as to whether we support Israel or not.
Last question, Mike. American weakness is always a great cause of instability in the Middle East, and I can't remember a weaker president than Joe Biden. And I'd like to ask you why he's behaving like this, because as I understand it, basically saying, come on, Netanyahu, stop all this, suffer the children and get the aid in and stop this conflict, ceasefire immediately. Why is he doing this? Because as I understand it, something like 84% of Americans support Israel.
Joe Biden's track record in foreign policy is unblemished by failure. And if you look at what he's doing right now, he's poll testing national security. And our leaders they get elected to not take us to war, but to protect the interest of our country, particularly our vital national interest. And essentially what he's doing is he's withering to the social media and the political pressure by the pro-Palestinian, pro-Iranian factions that are here in the United States, because he's looking at which states he needs to win in November to get elected. And if you look at Minnesota and some of these other states, they're very pro-Palestinian. So it is really unfortunate and compromising that our commander-in-chief and your prime minister, in my opinion, are poll testing and deciding what the right answer is from a national security perspective based on getting reelected. And the last thing I will say that you have touched upon, I've never seen more potential for miscalculation around the globe than I have seen right now, between the South China Sea, between Ukraine, between the Middle East. And you can trace all this back to one area, which is American weakness or a gap in American support on the international stage.
Mike, fantastic to
you.
talk to you. Thank you so much for your time.